What's going on, squad? So for those that didn't know, the Isochain was originally designed to be the ultimate isometric training device. It has a yielding load via the high strength spring. When we talk about training techniques, it's pretty versatile. Doesn't take up a lot of space and records our force levels, most importantly, allowing for feedback, progressive training, and having progressive overload enter the chat. But what happens if we don't have that on us? Well, luckily, ISOs are the most accessible form of training that exists. And it's one of the reasons it's remained so popular over the course of centuries. Even without any special equipment or weights, there's still 4 forms of isometric training available to us. So we're gonna cover those at kind of like a bird's eye view. We're not gonna go too much in detail on each one. So I'm gonna make sure we cover all of that in this video. Let's get into it. Alright, so we know this one, overcoming isometric training, but hold on, going a step above that, this is static state training. It's where an athlete pushes or pulls against a completely immovable object. Think like a doorway or a wall or something. This is probably the purest form of isometrics because once we're in a hold, there is no movement. The load is fixed. But because the load is fixed, there is no engagement to the loading reflex. If you haven't seen a video on the loading reflex, the squad channel, check this link out. It'll show you exactly what it's all about. The loading reflex is vital to building limit strength. Because we can use pretty much everyday objects for this type of training, it is pretty convenient, but just remember, there is no way to measure the forces during this type of training. Now, let's switch to number 2, self-resistance training. Think of Charles Atlas dynamic tension, pitting one muscle group against the other. This form is when one limb or group of muscles generate a load and another limb or another group of muscles contracts against that load. Here's a quick example. Here we go, pushing, areas of effect, boom, boom. It looks unimpressive, honestly, like most isometric exercises do, but believe it or not, relatively high forces of power can be generated doing that, pitting one group of muscles against the other. Charles Atlas knew what he was talking about. This type of training works multiple areas of the body at once. Techniques are pretty easy to perform, and you can branch off of those with everyday objects like a towel, or we can exploit our body's weight by either lying down on it, standing, or sitting on the towel. Just think if I had a towel and I'm trying to pull it apart, what's that working right now if I have the towel in my hands? My rear delts. In which case, that would be creating a static state hold like what we just covered a few minutes ago. Unfortunately though, although it is a live load, again, there's no loading reflex. There's no need for our nervous system to break any strength limits utilizing this type of isometric training because the load is regulated by our own brain, putting limits on it. Our brain can just down-regulate a load that's comfortable, a comfort zone. And of course, this form of training suffers from lack of measurability as well. But the point is, it's another form of training we have access to, maybe if the world went to hell. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Then we have my favorite of the 4, loadless training, sometimes called isotension. And I do have a video on that, so if you haven't seen that video, here's a link right here. A quick recap, what does that involve? There's static hold, where we tense various muscles against their antagonist muscle. So for example, if we're tensing the arm, what's happening right now? Both the biceps and the triceps are pulling as I'm tensing my arm right now. So even when the forces are high, the load is still 0. You'll see this type of training with a lot of traditional forms of martial arts. I know when I was younger, I used to run into this stuff and I was like, why are we doing this? Makes a lot more sense now. They probably didn't even realize why they were teaching it. It's just that they were teaching it. It makes them stronger, and that's pretty much all they knew. They probably didn't know about all the science behind it. You'll also see isotension a lot in bodybuilding. I mean, think about it. If we just flex like this, I mean, it's gonna be different than flexing like this. This style of training, isotension, loadless training, it's got a ton of benefits and maybe the most convenient form of strength training imaginable. There's no equipment, it can be performed anytime. In some cases, without people even knowing you're doing it, like at the grocery store. You could be doing that. Nobody would know. How would they know? It also works pretty well for athletes that are recovering from some musculoskeletal injuries. I wish I had known that in the past. I mean, this is years ago. I wish I had known that. But again, it doesn't allow for measurability. And for the same reason as with the self-resistance training, loading reflex is also absent, which is going to bring us to bodyweight gravity isometrics. What is this? Instead of using immovable external objects or static state isometrics, or using the body's own muscles, self-resistance or loadless training, this type of isometric training involves holding still under the body's own weight. What I mean by that, it's a handstand. Gravity is providing the force for this one. We could also think of yoga, right? Our body is under load It is. And honestly, a major benefit of this group is that because gravity is an external force, loading reflex has entered the chat. Obviously, we can't measure forces with this method, but we can measure strength progress up to a certain degree as our athletes start to level up in strength progressions due to different movements. Getting better at the human flag. We could only hold it for a few seconds, then we could hold it for like 30 seconds. Timer and attention. We could also think of it as we're learning to do handstand, we'll first do it on the wall, and then as we get better, leveling up through the progressions, we could do it in the middle of the floor. I cannot do that, by the way. It is a goal of mine though, so eventually. On the downside though, while this method can definitely build up some serious strength, I was kind of alluding to this part earlier, these techniques typically require a lot of balance and coordination. Meaning what? It's a less efficient form of training. Still works, just a little less efficient than self-resistance. I mean, think about how efficient is this? I'm doing it right now. I don't have to set anything up. You know, my balance has nothing to do with this. My balance has nothing to do with this either. This still doesn't require a lot of equipment. Some of them do require a horizontal gymnast bar or a vertical pole, like for example, like the human flag. I like doing the human flag. Maybe I should post a picture on it. After discussing all four of these, you can see that the first three suffer from not having a loading reflex. We need that. Does it mean that they're useless? Of course not. What it does mean though, and this is really important to understand with isometrics, is that if there is no loading reflex, the human body cannot its maximum voluntary strength. It can't. The loading reflex needs to be present for that. Plus, there's no way for the athlete to, they don't know how much force they're generating either because there's no display. So for progress or motivation, it's just, also, there's a little bit of extra tip. It's pretty tough to find exercises with any of these approaches which work the legs optimally. What, wall sit? I mean, do wall sits work? Yeah, they burn. If you've done one, you know what I mean. But for these reasons, the zero tech versions are inferior to the Isochain. But this is not to talk crap on them either. This is just to give us more weapons in our arsenal, all right? Because we already know the value of isometric training on the channel. We've seen ridiculously crazy things happen when we see isometrics utilized to the extreme. And what did they have? They had zero tech isos, right? So now that we have more modernized equipment, we could take some of these insane feats to the next level. Get you excited, doesn't it? Now here's what I want to end on. These zero tech methods do possess benefits. They're time tested, some of which are time tested for thousands of years, and every single one of them have been proven to increase strength. They all have positive impact on the joints and tissues, just like we've been talking about with the isometrics and bulletproofing. They're all relatively low skill, meaning we could pick them up pretty quickly and perform them pretty regularly with no period of relearning required. We could just convenient, it's adaptable, and of course no special equipment required. It could be done anywhere. For these reasons, it would be useful for athletes who are pretty consistent on the Isochain to remember some of these techniques and use them in their training repertoire. Why? They're pretty practical and they're effective 100% of the time. Think about it. Vacation, variety, being used in addition to Isochain work, warm-up drills, rehab, and just active recovery too. It's a lot of uses. But what are your thoughts? Have you ever utilized zero tech isos before? If you have, comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, if you liked the video, be sure to drop a like. Go ahead and comment. If you're not yet part of NoLimitSquad, hit that subscribe button. Come join the squad with us. We'll see you next video. Peace.